What have we talked about so far? Key points.
Methods of writing.
Say that again.
Methods of writing.
Methods of writing. Okay. The very ancient methods of writing.
The different kind of materials that it's written on.
Different kind of materials. Not very unlike what we have today. That's right.
How God is in the background.
God is in the background, working at the perfect time, taking advantage of the things we do, both good and bad, for His purpose. Absolutely. God is back in the background. He is working back there. You think when you go to see a play, all you think about are the people that are on the lights out front, but you don't realize there's an army of people in the background. God is that army. His kingdom is in the background for sure, keeping things going, running. What else?
The etymology of some of the different things like papyrus and paper, and tablet and biblios.
Yeah. Methods, languages, by which capture this. We use the term biblios, which is a Greek term. What's that mean? What's the term biblios mean in Greek? Books. Yeah, books. Exactly right. So that's where we get the term Bible, right? It is a collection of books, right? It is the book. It's a collection of books. So there's and we talked a little bit about language. We talked about a couple languages, and we're going to delve into that today a little bit closer to understand the languages that the Bible was written in and why they're written in that language, what it means today, how it might have changed, and how it might have help us with our understanding today. So we're still in our same outline. Does anybody need another outline? It's the same one from last week. You didn't bring it with you last week. It's okay. We're going to charge double.
Yep.
We charged you nothing last week, so we're going to charge you nothing again this week. Uh-huh. It's in the budget. You're welcome. You're very welcome. I think there's just enough there. You're welcome. So, you got your carrot? Okay. So, last week we ended up talking about scribes, right? We ended up talking about how it was copied and how it was passed along. We didn't have mimeograph machines and copy machines, right? So it had to be hand copied. And we talked about it wasn't a matter of really one person making a bunch of copies. How are all these copies made of a writing?
They're with
scribes.
By scribes, yeah, by people who are educated and skilled in the language and capturing it and the materials. You know, there was somebody who probably dictated it, right? So they spoke it, and a room full of people captured it. And why was that method a good method? What good came out of that process?
Less errors.
Less errors, because why? We seem to get a lot of people writing that would be my opportunity for a lot of errors. How did that reduce errors? They can compare. Yeah. If I'm speaking it and you're the only one writing it, Mike, there's nobody to check you, right? But if Dale copies it and Jim copies it and George copies it, then okay, we can actually look now and say, wait a minute, hang on a second. And besides that, we can take those different manuscripts and we can compare them and say, okay, wait a minute, was this a grammar error here? Was this a spelling error here? Did you hear it wrong? Right, that type of thing. So as the centuries go by and we get access to all these different manuscripts, that gives us confidence in what was really meant to be said, right? If someone asked you after you leave this room today what was said, how can we have confidence of what was really said? By consensus of thought, right? So that copying method gave us consensus of thought, which helps give us confidence in what was being meant to be, what was written down originally. We don't have as you mentioned, we don't have the original writings of any of the writers of the Bible. There is no original copy anywhere of Matthew or Job or anything like that. There's no original copy. These are all copies passed down because of the reasons we've talked about. The medium by which they were written down on has long since been disintegrated and lost, but there's been methods to continue to move it on and move it on and move it on. How many of you have had to dispose of an old Bible that just outlived its usefulness? Doesn't it hurt to get rid of it? I mean, I hang on to it, right? This is a fairly new one. I think this is probably 4 years old, and it's already starting to see some wear. And I've got some. I showed the one our first week that they gave me at the church when I was baptized. I don't think I could use it anymore. It's just disintegrating.
Sitting on the shelf.
It's sitting on a shelf. It's a collector's item. It's a showpiece, right? But at some point, somebody along the way is going to have to dispose of that. Even though it's written on modern materials with modern inks and modern binding methods, it has a finite lifespan, right? And it won't even outlive me, probably. But so imagine we don't have the original writings. We've had to rely on the people that have copied them and moved them on through the centuries. So we're going to be on page 2 here of our outline, about halfway down. We're going to take a look at the way the Bible was organized. So keep in mind, there were all these writings over what span of time was the Bible written? What span of time? About 1,500 years. That's a long time, right? I mean, if we think about all the modern literature, that only spans 300 or 400 years, 500 years maybe, go back to Shakespeare-ish. So we don't have much to rival the span of time this was written in with ancient methods a long time ago, right? So this was a collection of writings over a very long period of time, and we mentioned last week about when they started to get compiled, when the Old Testament writings started to get compiled. When was that? And they actually started to put them in some kind of a collective form. Remember what that was? About 400 BC, 450 BC, around the time of Ezra, when they had come back from Babylonian captivity, you have kind of a new nation forming. And so there was this push to, hey, let's get our stuff collected here. We've been scattered. We had been a kingdom. We kind of went astray. We paid our dues. We came back. There's a remnant. Now there's this push to say, let's collect all these old writings that we've had all this time and start to get them into a form. And so you'll see here on about halfway down page 2 here, the form of our Bible today dates back to that activity that happened around 400 BC. So at that time, all they had were the ancient Hebrew writings. But now we have some new writings that came around 50 to 100 AD, and that is what we call the New Testament, the New Covenant, and the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. And so we have these two structures, and this word testament comes from the Greek word diatheke, which is better rendered as covenant. We think of a last will and covenant. What does that mean to you? If I leave a last will and covenant, what am I saying? Testimony? Promise. Promise.
An agreement?
An agreement. Excuse me. Jim, that's a great way to look at it. It's an agreement. It's a deal I'm going to make with you. My declaration, kind of, right? This is my testimony is my covenant, it's my agreement. Excuse me. It's my deal. It's what I'm declaring to be true. It's how things are going to work. Right? My parents recently passed away. I went through, there's a will, there's a trust. It declares how things are going to work. Right? We had an old deal. This is how things work. This is how it's going to work. You're going to follow this process, right? This set of rules, this set of guidelines. This is the agreement I make with my people. You do things this way, I will do this. Jesus came along, ended that deal. We're going to have a new deal, a new covenant. Right? And so now we have this new agreement. But it's often good to look back at the old agreement, isn't it? My parents made some changes to their will, and I can see that in there. I can look at it. Because things changed over time. Right? From the very beginning when they made their first one, well, things changed. Right? Children grew up. My brother passed away. Right? Things changed over time. It's like we need to make a new deal, a new agreement. And so what we have here, we have record of the two deals. The two agreements, and provided these two structures for us today. So obviously the new covenant has replaced the old covenant. The old one doesn't matter. When I look at this new one, I say, here's the new one dated a certain date. This now overrides anything before that. That's the whole concept behind the Old and the New Testament. And sometimes I don't know if we really get our heads around that, but it's a new deal, a new agreement that supersedes the old one. So the Old Covenant structure in English Bibles, you'll see it outlined here. 5 books of the law, the Pentateuch, we talked about that, Genesis to Deuteronomy. That's the law. 12 books of history, Joshua to Esther. 5 books of poetry, it's Job to the Song of Solomon. And 17 books of prophets divided into major prophets and minor prophets. This arrangement of the Old Testament dates back to a Christian arrangement. So, when we start to look at the different translations and the different texts, we're going to study something in detail called the Latin Vulgate. Who's ever heard of that? The Latin Vulgate. A few people. The Latin Vulgate, what's that mean? Vulgate. Where's that word? What's the root of that word? What do you think? Vulgar. Who said that? Larry. 5 points. Lunch. Your first in line at lunch. Excellent. Outstanding. What? It's a vulgar translation? What do you mean by that? What do we mean by that? If we say that's vulgar language, what do we mean today if we say that?
So people could read it.
But what do we mean today if I say that's a vulgar language?
It's not a high educated.
Yeah, it's street language. It's guttural. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Man, this group is top. Second in line lunch. Thank you. It's the street language, language of the people. That's what it means, right? What language was the New Testament written in?
Greek.
Greek.
Also the language of the people.
Okay, but however, the Greek, it wasn't like it was today, right? You had all these different peoples around the world speaking their language, but then you had like official language, the language that business was done in, or that diplomacy was done in. And Koine Greek was that language at that time. If you wanted to write something that could go across borders around the world, be understood, be translated from, you wrote in this language called Koine Greek. Okay, it was kind of like a high-class Greek, a high-class language, right?
No.
So these writers wrote in that language. They wrote in this language that was actually more of like an official language. What happened over time was nobody could.
Asiatic Greek, the high level Greek.
I'm not a Greek scholar, but Koine Greek doesn't even exist today.
Well, koine, we get the word koinonia or fellowship.
Mhm.
That's the common Greek.
Okay.
But there was an Attic Greek, which is the more
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
high level Greek. The New Testament was not written in the Attic Greek. It was written in Koine Greek. Which is lower level.
Yeah, it could be. It could go everywhere. Everybody could understand it, right? They didn't walk around speaking that language. We talked about this last week. Jesus didn't walk amongst his people speaking Greek, but Matthew captured it in Greek. It's kind of interesting. So we're gonna look at the languages here in a bit. But this Latin Vulgate translation, this was the first attempt to translate it out of the original Greek into something usable for the people. Because what happened over time is Latin became somewhat of the dominant language throughout the Roman Empire. So there was a movement to translate this thing into a usable language. But that was looked at very, very poorly. And I tell you what, we're going to see this throughout our study throughout the next few weeks. As we see the language changing, the translation changing, there was, I would say, for 1,500 years of Christian history, it was a big no-no to translate. I mean, you ran into a lot of trouble when you tried to translate the Bible. We're going to see that especially when we get to the English translations. I mean, people lost their heads over that. So that was not a good, can you believe that Christians actually looked at it like, I don't want to translate this into a readable form? That to me, that just makes my head spin. But that was the way society worked in a lot of places, and the church worked a lot of times. So this movement to translate to the Latin was an extremely important move. It gave us our structure that we have today. It gave us the foundation for some later translations, like the King James that we use quite a bit. The King James was a major foundation for other modern translations. So that structure dates back to the Latin Vulgate. The structure of the Hebrew Bible is slightly different. Exactly the same books. It's really important to understand they're exactly the same books in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew and the English Bibles. Exactly the same books, exactly the same words. But they are rearranged slightly different. We talked about how the English Bible arranges it. The Hebrew Bible is arranged in 4 sections. You've got the Law, the Prophets, and you can see here how they arrange them slightly different. They call it the Writings. That has some history in there and some poetry. Then you've got a section called the 12, which is just essentially the prophets. So you'll see they arrange slightly differently. It's a different order. Sometimes they're categorized slightly differently, but exactly the same books. The Old Testament books in as we said, the Protestant English Bible are exactly the same. When we start to look at the canonization, we're going to find that there are a lot of books that are still lingering out there that are not in the Hebrew Bible, they're not in the Protestant Christian Bible, but they may be in the Catholic Bible. Okay? And those writings primarily come in that intertestamental period, but not always. But there are a lot that come from that 400-year silent period there. So again, the New Covenant structure, grouped into 3 parts. You've got history, which is Matthew through Acts. The first are called the Gospels. The Gospel means what? Good news. Yeah. And the first 3 are called Synoptic Gospels because they have similar content. They essentially follow the same flow, right? We do know that John was written at a later date, and it was written from a personal point of view. We kind of use that example of a car accident. Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of observe the accident, right? Or Luke reports on the accident. Right, okay. Matthew and Mark saw it. Luke reported on it. John was in the car. That's where I kind of look at it. So you get all these different perspectives on what happened, right? You get this, Luke gives you this third-person perspective, right? He wasn't necessarily there in the middle of that, but he's reporting on it. And he's compiling all this stuff together. Matthew and Mark witnessed it. John was part of it, right? We talked about Acts being a continuation of Luke. And why do we think that it's 2 separate books? Remember that?
Because of the length.
It's too big.
Because he is the way it was written. He took my formal book.
Say that again?
When Acts was written, he wrote that in my formal book.
Yeah. Why did you took a break though? Why don't you just keep going? Because the stories keep rolling. It was too big. Yeah, I mean, it was just too big. I mean, we could, get some pretty good books around here. I mean, it would have been possible to make a book scroll that thick. It just became limited by the means, right? So it's probably why. And so here's the next scroll, my previous scroll, right? You ever see a TV show, last week on Lost or whatever it was, right? They give you, right, they refer back to it to keep the continuity going. Then you've got doctrine here, which is Romans through Jude, written by inspired men again. Paul was the primary writer there. The Pauline letters, you probably heard refer to that. And even the Pauline letters can be divided up into a couple groups. Written the group before imprisonment and the group after imprisonment or during imprisonment. And then you've got Hebrews, author unknown, often attributed to Paul. I don't know. I'd love to do a great study on that. Great study on Hebrews, where it came from. I heard a sermon one time that made a good argument that it wasn't Paul, but then I've also heard great arguments that it is. But the collectors of it feel confident enough in the inspirational nature of it to include it during the canon. Remember, the canon happened a long, long time ago, way before us, right? So they had writings, maybe access to some things we didn't have, and so that decision was to go ahead and include it, even though it doesn't specifically say who the writer is. Yeah, James?
Took it enough for Apollos and Luke, and I think I lean more toward Luke because I think it has more medical terms than the other writings, but it is the teachings of Paul. And of course, Luke and Paul traveled together a lot, so I'm leaning toward Luke.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's an interesting challenge of the mind, trying to figure out who does this read like. Does it read like somebody else we know, or does it not? I don't know. So it's interesting. And then you've got one book of prophecy, Revelation, often called the book of the Apocalypse. Written in lots of symbolic language. It doesn't read like anything else in the Bible, does it? Maybe Daniel a little bit. But obviously, it's you can tell it's written much later. You can tell it's in a different context. So, thoughts, comments about the structure of the Bible, the books we have, the ones we were left with, and the structure itself. Before we go looking at languages. So the Bible was originally written in 3 languages. Hebrew, the entire Old Testament is written in Hebrew. It's still the spoken language of Israel today, the state of Israel. Hebrew is from the family of what's called Semitic languages. It's akin to Aramaic, Syriac, Akkadian, and Aramaic is still spoken today in that part of the world. Syria, that part of the world there still speaks Aramaic. So that language is still alive. It's still going. It's not a dead language. Aramaic is alive, is a living, breathing language there today. So that's very interesting. But Hebrew is akin to that. It's from the same origins as Aramaic. You can tell the Hebrew-speaking people came from that area, right? When they went to Egypt, they came from that area, they brought their language. When they came back, the language had changed around there. Now you've got this slightly different language. And, but it's very, very similar to that. It's written backwards. We passed around a interlinear Bible here a few weeks ago, if you got to see that. Have you ever really read an interlinear and see how it lines up with Hebrew? It's very difficult to read backwards. My brain doesn't work that way, reading right to left, but it reads right to left. Sounds very, very foreign to English speakers. I mean, it doesn't sound like obviously you can tell it doesn't have a basis in Latin like our language does, so it sounds very, very foreign. A lot of pronunciations are very, very different. And this is kind of interesting. Hebrew did originally not contain vowels. Vowels were added later to aid in pronunciation. If you think about it, I can write something probably without a vowel, and you can figure it out, right? My name, for instance. If I wrote my name without a vowel, how would you pronounce that? Well, because you know it. Okay. How about if I say, how do I pronounce his name? Maybe it's Mock. Maybe it's Merk. Mick. Maybe it's Mark. Maybe it's Mick. Right? So what's the vowel do? What's the vowel do?
Give it more definition. Give it more definition?
Yeah, it helps us to figure out how to pronounce this. Is this draw, drew, draw? You know, what is that? Right? Is this Mark, Mock, Mick? What is that? Well, the vowels tell you how to pronounce that. Right? It tells it does. You think about it. You very, except for like the words I and A. I mean, you really don't have vowel words. Right? The word is the consonant. Right? The vowel tells you how to pronounce it. I think that's kind of interesting. So Hebrew originally didn't have vowels. Right? It was just consonants. Well, you're going to run into all kinds of pronunciation problems. Right? So that was put in later for us, you know, them as well, to understand how to pronounce this and get some definition and some agreement on how that word is pronounced. That's kind of interesting. Interesting tidbit in the past. Mike, you have a
Yeah,
big
you taught me something which is hard to do sometimes. But you know, since I've always about the vowels not being in it, I was always told in the past they always concentrate on the name Jehovah, and they said because the Jews didn't want God's name spelled out, so they just put the vowels in there. But it's interesting to know that the entire Old Testament was written without vowels.
well, the language originally didn't have that.
Yeah.
It was just sounds.
Yeah.
And I don't know Hebrew, but it's kind of interesting. I'd encourage you to go to your computer today or something and go to translate and type in some English words you know and have it translate to Hebrew with the audio on. It's very interesting. It sounds very interesting. It's a challenge to the mind that sound. Yes, sir.
I don't know if Hebrew didn't have vowels, or they just didn't write them to save ink, to save time, to save papyrus. They just wrote the consonants because that's all you really needed, supposedly.
Probably.
But by God's name, they call it the Tetragrammaton, and it's 4 letters. But without the vowels, we're not really sure how his name was pronounced. And one reason they did that is they didn't want people pronouncing his name because there was one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not take my name in vain. Well, if you don't use his name, you can't take it in vain, right?
It's
And
true.
so,
Yeah.
in many ways, it's been so long, we've kind of forgotten how his name is pronounced. And we only have the 4 consonants.
Well, we don't speak Hebrew, so we're speaking in our name.
Yeah, Jehovah, I think that's a German derivation.
Could be. I mean, everything we have today is translated or transliterated, so we're not speaking anything really in the original Hebrew. You know, the closest you can come in an English Bible is probably Psalms, which has different sections divided up, right, in the Hebrew word there. But they don't mean anything to us. Read a translation tells what that means. You know, I remember as Beth, because my daughter did. Remember as a Beth in there. Very interesting. So, and then the other language, very, very occasional, shows up is Aramaic. This is spoken in modern-day Syria today. This became the common tongue in the area of Palestine after the time of the exile. So when the Hebrews came back from exile, they brought this language back. This was the language of the people. Okay, this is the language they were speaking. The children grew up speaking Aramaic. If we went and grabbed a bunch of people from another country, brought them here, they had children, they perished, their children raised here, what language would they read and speak? English. they would go home speaking the language they picked up here. And that's what happened. So Jesus and his people, as they walked the streets, spoke Aramaic. That was the language. After several centuries, that became language. Now remember, it was akin to Hebrew. So even though they weren't speaking Hebrew and it's an official language, it's from the same. It's kind of like I can probably pick you up and plop you down in France or something, or Germany, and you could probably start to pick out some words. They come from the same origins, right? You can pick it out. You can probably look through a French newspaper and find enough words. Go, I think I know what that means. Okay, and after a while, you're going to be able. You could probably order food if you had to. I went into I was in Paris once for business years ago, and I took French in high school and in college, and I thought, I'm going to order breakfast in French. So, do omelette s'il vous plaît. Do omelette s'il vous plaît. Okay. So I said, sat down. The guy comes over and I says, do omelette s'il vous plaît. And he says, you want orange juice with that? I'm like, was it that bad? He said, yeah. I'm like, okay. So anyway, you can get by, right? And so that's kind of what the idea is here. Now, Aramaic, why does it show up several times? What is the reason for Aramaic showing up every once in a while? Especially in the New Testament. Yeah.
Well, I don't know how many books in the Old Testament do this, but I know that Daniel switches between Hebrew and Aramaic. The center of it is in Aramaic. Chapter 1 is Hebrew, and then 2 through 7 are Aramaic, and then goes back to Hebrew. And we kind of discussed that in class one day, and one of the thoughts was perhaps it's because of the targeted audience. The stuff in Hebrew perhaps was targeted at the Hebrews, and then the Aramaic was targeted more towards the rest of the people.
Could be, yeah. Daniel is written during that time of captivity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this, I'm writing it in your language. Could it be for effect? If you look at the New Testament, here you've got, in point 4, many of Jesus' expressions are in Aramaic. I absolutely think it's for effect. And you'll see this actually in English literature. Sometimes you'll see like something, all of a sudden a French phrase will come in. It's like, what was the point of that French phrase? It's like it's for effect, because that's where like the real meaning of that word comes from. You'll see that sometimes, right? It's not an accident, it's for purpose. And so there could be something in Daniel like that. And if you think about the things so remember, Jesus spoke Aramaic. He's quoted in Greek for most of the New Testament. But every once in a while you have these Aramaic expressions. Talitha kumai, right? Little girl, get up. It's like it's for effect. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. I mean, this is his dying moments, right? This is what he would have said in the language it was said in. I think that's really for effect, right? So it's a literary device there that the writer uses, right? And Jesus referred to God as Abba. I don't know. I would make an argument that there's God's name, right? In a language that's we're transliterating that to us today. Jesus used that term. Pretty good for me. I like it, right? That's an Aramaic term. He didn't say, or Matthew didn't write Jehovah. He wrote the word Abba. This is the word Jesus used. It's very interesting. Yes?
Couldn't it also be because the people used that terminology and knew it? Like the word conference is not English. In German it's Konferenz, it's not German. It's French, but everybody knows it, no matter what language you're in, because it was a term that everyone used and knew the meaning of.
Yeah.
So not just for effect, but because everybody knew what that meant, no matter what language you speak.
Well, good point. But I would say once this remember the whole idea about why it was written in Greek was for it to be universally accepted
Yeah,
and moved
but
around.
everybody would know the term, just like if you say conference, no matter what language you go to, everybody knows it.
Yeah, that's probably true. Right? There's like television's another word that it's an English word, got picked up. I think every language.
And every language knows it.
Yeah. So yeah, could be on something there. Yeah. So there are many expressions in the New Testament that clearly show Jesus used Aramaic. Maranatha is another one. So this Aramaic language shows up, as Dale said. It's a big chunk in Daniel. and then it's sporadic in quoted terms throughout the New Testament there in Jesus quoting mainly. And then the third language is Greek, right? Modern Greek is quite different from Greek of the New Testament. It was considered the universal language of the modern world at that time, just as English is today. We've talked about that. If you wanted a vast audience, Greek was the language you would choose. It could go to any country and be academically understood. It could be changed, translated. There's a baseline understanding. Again, my understanding is that's where the Rosetta Stone gets its brilliance, right? It's got this language we know we can translate from this base language here. And now, all of a sudden now we can translate the hieroglyphs because of this base language. So that's what you want. You're writing a base language. So I don't think you have the New Testament written in Aramaic. Because once it gets out of that region, who speaks it? Right? It doesn't mean it's going to go, oh my goodness. We're going to look at, we talked the Septuagint on the first week, right? The Septuagint was an effort by the Greeks to get this Old Testament Bible into something we could read. So it's a translation from Hebrew and Greek. Because people that weren't the Hebrew nation couldn't read Greek, couldn't read Hebrew, right? It had to be translated into something else. So you see the base language is very, very, very important. So we talked about the fact that the language of the New Testament was this Koine or Common Greek. So yes, Jim, I am staying corrected there. It was Common Greek. It was a literary more than a spoken Greek is how it was kind of known. But again, a modern Greek today is a little different from that. And I think it's very interesting that the New Testament contains many Semitic idioms. What's an idiom?
It's an expression that can't be translated directly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a good way to put it. That's perfect. It's an expression that if you translate directly in our language, it doesn't make much sense, right? Or it's hard to kind of take, right? In fact, I saw one of my colleagues put out a post on Instagram the other day about, don't if you're going to do things in international business, don't use idioms because they're very confusing across borders. But we use them all the time in our language here. Truly I say to you, there's one. It came to pass. Behold, right? These words were idioms that came from the Semitic language that we've just transliterated. We've taken them into our language today, and we embrace them. We hold them very dear. So made distinctive Christian words as well: grace, peace, gospel, salvation, etc. Those are words that became part of the English language. They came from these Semitic words. And now we've just taken them in. So, yeah, Gospels, they didn't go around. Again, the English language is a relatively modern language anyway, right? You didn't have the English language back when the New Testament was written. So, those words just became part of our language. Thoughts, comments about that? Yes, sir.
Most languages that have a common base, like English is a Germanic language. Spanish, French are Latin languages. What's Greek? Is it a Latin language?
No.
It's before.
It's an Eastern language.
Yeah. So
Yeah. I don't know the origins of Greek. That's a great one. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to know where. I love linguistics. If I were ever going to go study something for a hobby, it'd be interesting to study where these languages came from.
like if you learn Spanish, you can usually get by with a little French or a little Italian. You can understand it a little bit with that. Yeah. German, the same thing. A lot of words are so similar in English that, other than the clearing of the throat for every consonant, you can make it out.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering about that and how, what maybe common ancestor between some of those languages.
Yeah, there probably is. Obviously, we have lots of words that have Greek origins in the English language. So as these Latin languages, these Germanic languages came about, they use a lot of Greek foundation there. Again, this is not really it's not my expertise by any stretch, but there are a lot of words. We've already talked about a lot of them. Ostracized, testament, right? There's words that come from a Greek origin. That's, Greek or Latin tend to be the two common ones. If you're going to do medicine or law, Greek and Latin tend to have those dominant forces there. Yes, sir.
English is made up of a lot of Greek, a lot of Latin. It's very similar to German. I'm amazed how many French words there are in the English
Yeah,
language.
yeah, we're kind of a conglomeration of it.
Yeah.
I think it's the history of the English people, where they came from, their influences were Germanic and Latin in origin, and so, yeah, so it formed our language quite a bit, absolutely. So before we step into scribes here to wrap up again, just to kind of recap on the scribes, there were these two fundamental translations that are gonna launch us into the coming week or two, and that's the Septuagint. Now, this isn't in the outline, but we did talk a bit about that. We mentioned about this in week 1. So the Greeks take over the known world back around 330 BC, something like that, right? There's Greek kings installed in the 4 major corners of the known world at that time. And the Ptolemaic king in Egypt at the time had built this great library at Alexandria. You probably heard about the Alexandria Library. And they were all about collecting the great books and the great writings of the time. They heard about this Hebrew Bible, this Hebrew collection of writings, but we get a hold of them, but behold, they're in Hebrew. My people can't read them. Come to the library, it's Hebrew. Nobody here reads Hebrew. I need this translated for me. So the king and his people go out and hire 70 of the sharpest, brightest Hebrew scholars and scribes to translate this Hebrew Bible into Greek. The Septuagint was the result. That was the name of that Bible. The Septuagint was the name of that collection. The Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. Okay? That Septuagint, powerful, fundamental. A lot of the expressions we have today come from the Greek from that. So we talk about, we have these quotes of Jesus in Aramaic. When Matthew quotes Jesus quoting the Old Testament in Greek, he's quoting the Septuagint. I think that is extremely cool. So think about that. You've got Jesus, here's Matthew capturing Jesus' words. He was speaking Aramaic, but the quote that he's using is from the Septuagint. That was the Greek common universal Bible in everyday tongue at that time. So we can go back, we can translate from that Septuagint with confidence that that's just as good as the original Hebrew almost. Because this is the one Jesus was quoting from.
Drew,
That's pretty cool.
Drew,
Yes,
I think I lost track of what you were saying.
Okay.
The Septuagint
Septuagint.
was
I'm
people.
going to try and spell this from memory. Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Old Testament that was in Hebrew. Right? The Old Testament was in Hebrew. They wrote that in Hebrew. They copied it in Hebrew. They used it in Hebrew. That was worthless to people that didn't speak Hebrew, right? So the Ptolemaic king said, I want that thing translated into something that my people can read, that I can have in my library. So he brought these 70 scholars down and had them translate that thing into Greek. We call that translation the Septuagint.
Okay, so you're saying it was in Greek, but it's called.
It's called the Septuagint, just like we call this the ESV, right? That was called the Septuagint. Now, isn't it interesting he brought 70 scholars? Why not just bring one guy down to translate it?
Make sure it was all right.
Maybe the same reason we had scribes.
Exactly the same reason. I want consensus here. I want accuracy. I don't want somebody going, hey, this guy this is a good scholar, but he's not a fan of Job, so he messed with Job a little bit to make it look and sound the way he wanted. Nah. Come down. I want the exact thing.
Law of averages.
That's right. I want a perfect translation. And when we look at the King James Version, it's like, head explodes. The effort that went into that to make sure that thing was done as good as we could get it. Yes, sir.
Septuagint means 70.
It means 70, exactly right. Yep.
That's why they call it the
Yep.
Septuagint.
Yep.
It's translated.
By 70 people, exactly right. So it's interesting though that when Jesus is quoting the Old Testament, it's Septuagint grammar and structure in that Greek. In the original Greek, writing of Matthew, that's really interesting. He's quoting from the Septuagint. So that's an important, would you say that's an important translation? I think that's a pretty important translation, right? The other one is the Latin Vulgate. This pen is dying. We talked about the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate then was obviously Latin translation, right? Where do you think the Old Testament came from in the Latin Vulgate? Septuagint. They use that's the foundation, of the basis, right? If I'm gonna translate these Greek writings into Latin, well, what a better place to go. You already kind of started for me, right? Otherwise I gotta go to Hebrew. But it was a big undertaking. They had Hebrew, they had original writings, they had Hebrew writings, they had the Septuagint, right? But the Latin Vulgate was the first real attempt to get the entire Old and New Testament into somewhat of a common language that people could use. The Latin Vulgate, I believe, is still the official translation of the Catholic Church. So, super important, right? When they went to do all the English and other translations back in the 1600s, they started with Latin Vulgate. All the work had been done. The problem there is you're translating from a translation, right? So you've got to go back and make sure you're validating a lot of things correctly and checking against the original manuscripts. So we're going to look at that when we talk about restoring the texts. So that's our time. Thoughts, comments? We've got structure. We've got the original writers. We've got materials they wrote on. We've got the time span within it was written. What else do we have? Some very early translations and compilings. Trying to get this thing organized. It's written by a lot of different people, by a long period of time. We've got to get it organized. We've got to get consolidated. We've got to get in a language that we can read. We've got to get in something we can use. What were the methods what were some of the methods that we used to copy it? Right? We talked about the scribes, right? That made sure it was copied accurately. The Hebrews even had just an amazing process for ensuring accurate copying. We're going to look at that here in about 3 or 4 weeks. That process, and then what do you do with the old copy that you copied from? Amazing process. And then we had something almost miraculous happen in last century that validated that. We're going to look at all that together. Yes?
I'm the odd that it's the number 70, number 7, 7 times 7.
Keeps coming back a lot. Yeah, there's certain numbers that come
Complete
back.
number, God.
A lot of numbers that come back over and over and over again.
Yeah, but 7.
Yeah.
7.
This guy who wasn't even a believer
Right,
had
pick 70.
picked 70, yeah.
Yeah,
Interesting.
quite interesting.
Any other thoughts before we wrap up? Want to come back for next week? Next week we're going to look at manuscripts of the New Testament. So this is where we start to look at where did the manuscripts come from that created this translation. So now we start to look at validating this thing. What do we have access to today? What have you heard about? How was this thing, what were all those different translations based on? That's the manuscripts of the New Testament. So very, very interesting. And then from there you go into texts and variations. Where are some variations? Where are there some things that don't agree? What do we do about that? What are the different texts that are out there? So come back next week, we'll look at texts, we'll look at the manuscripts, okay? All right, have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.